should need the PowerPoint yet. So if you just want to have it pulled up, that'd be fine. Cool. All right, guys. So today, as Mr. Miller said, we're going to be talking about Syria. And before we dig into it, I just want to take a minute and kind of like reflect on what we already know or what we already think about Syria. So if you guys could just like, when I say the word Syria, what is the first thing that comes to you guys' mind? We're going to just go ahead and like put these up on the board just to try to get like a visual word map of where we're at before we start. So I say Syria. What comes to you guys' mind? Yeah. Desert? Is that what you want to say? Yeah? No, that's great. Right, desert's got, one S. Because if it's two, then it's dessert, because one extra. Yeah?
Like on the left side of the Middle East.
Left side of the Middle East, so that would be, if we're looking at the Middle East, not left, but what would be like the direction?
West.
West. So it's Western Middle East?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just going to abbreviate Middle East ME. Yeah. Sorry, I can't hear it. Political problems, that's fantastic. So political problems. Does anyone know what type of political problems? Or do they have any insights into the types of problems? Anybody? Yeah.
Wasn't Syria the one with the Civil War? Civil
War, that's great. Did anyone see what happened with Syria and Turkey in the news yesterday? No? Who watches news? I didn't. I saw it on my YouTube feed. It was like a little news clip. So anyway, we will cover that later then. Does anyone else have any other thoughts on Syria? What else pops into your mind? This can be literally anything, yeah.
Probably wrong, but ISIS.
ISIS? Very good.
Confidence.
So I learned that ISIS has another name, and it's ISIL. So you're going to see these in the presentation. I use both ISIS and ISIL, but they are the same group. So that's something to remember.
What does the L stand for?
The L stands, so ISIS stood for Islamic State for like Iraq, and the L is because it changed to the Levant. So it's just like it's kind of all the same area. It's just semantics, I guess. Anything else? What about this side? What do you guys think of? It can be anything, like food related, whatever. Or are you just like blank slates on Syria? Which is fine if you guys are blank slates, that's why we're here. No? Anything else? Alright, cool. So what we got? We got desert, we got political problems, we know where it's located geography-wise in the Western Middle East, and ISIS or ISIL is an issue in the region. That's awesome. Alright. So... Mr. Miller, how do I
get off
send that over there? Thank you. Alright, so Syria. So for this lesson, our essential question, or the thing that we're going to be focused on the most, and I'm going to struggle with this all year, aren't I? All year. So basically we want to know, as, I don't remember who said Civil War, but basically our question is, how has the Civil War of this one country come to have such a profound impact on global society? So we're going to be coming back to this question at the end of the lesson, and that's just kind of what I want you guys to be thinking about here, because Syria is a relatively small country in the Middle East, but it's having this profound impact on the globe, both through its civil war and through the politics of its president. So as we go about, just keep that in the back of your mind, right? So to begin, we're kind of going to take like a historical look at Syria, just to try to understand. Yeah, can you guys see the board? Is that a whiteboard? Whiteboard in the way? So the land of Syria, from your guys' map, you guys know, it's located right in here. And this is the cradle of civilization, right? This is, when I talk to you guys about foods in the Middle East, I mentioned how civilizations rose out of this land. So this is a very ancient land that's really steeped in tradition. But for the most part of human history in this region, the area that we know today as Syria was under the control of empires. So first it was the Persians, then it was the Romans, then it was the Ottomans. So this land was always, they never had an independent state. They were always under the control of someone larger than them. Then, after the Ottoman Empire fell, post-World War II, so the Ottoman Empire had aligned themselves with Germany in the First World War. So after the First World War ended, the Ottoman Empire was dismantled. And that's what led to the creation of the country we know today as Turkey. So the Ottomans were called the Turks. After their empire fell, they created the country of Turkey, and the French actually gained control of the region we know today as Syria. Did you guys cover the Sykes-Picot Agreement? Did you touch on that?
It was in one of our subs.
In one of all sub-searching? So basically the Sykes-Picot Agreement allowed the French to take control of the region of Syria, and then they ruled that land as a mandate from 1920 to 1946. Does anyone know what happened and why in 1946 the French would have removed themselves? What was going on in the world, or what had just come to a conclusion? World War II, awesome. So World War II, you see this giant wave of colonial powers taking themselves out of land. So the French, they gave up a lot of colonial holdings. The British gave up a lot of colonial holdings. This is when India gains independence in this post-World War II era. And so this is the time where Syria as a country first develops. It's when the idea of an independent Syria is first created. And that lasted for about 20 years when what's called the Ba'ath maybe, Socialist Party, they stage a coup on the Republic, and in 1963 they gain power. This is the political entity that has retained power until this day. So the government of Syria, they are what's called a unitarian state. Basically what that means is they have a centralized government and they have all the power. So here in America we are not a unitarian state. We have both a national government and state governments, as well as local governments. But the state governments, they retain power independent of that of the national government. So there are certain things that the national government can't tell the states to do. They can't make them do it. And there are things that the states can't make the national government do. So they work together to try to keep the peace. In Syria, that's not the case. They have one government, and that government controls everything. Furthermore, this government, they don't have a bipartisan system like we have. You know, we have Democrats and Republicans, and then you can get in your Green parties and your other things like that. But primarily we have a bi-party system, bipartisan, Democrat-Republican, and that's what leads to much of our political discourse. Here in Syria, there is only one party. So what that leads to is your guy here, President Bashar al-Assad, he primarily runs for president unopposed. There is no one to stand in his way of gaining re-election because there is not a second party that can challenge the Ba'aths. So what happens is Bashar al-Assad is his full name. We're just going to call him President Assad for short. But basically, he's been the president of Syria since 2000. So that's 19 years that he's retained power over this country. He ran unopposed in the first 2 elections, and he served 7-year terms. And he took over the presidency from his father. His father, Hafez al-Assad, was president from 1971 to 2000. So he served for almost 30 years in office before his son took over. So that kind of shows you can frame it in your mind that it's almost a monarchy in the sense that it's very familial, or has been familial since the 70s. Now, the government and the religious atmosphere of Syria are kind of at odds. So the majority of the population within Syria are Sunni Muslims. Do you guys remember in your talks about Islam learning about the Shia and the Sunni and how they're different branches of Islam? Are we all clear on how that works? Okay, so the Sunni Muslims make up about 70% of the population of Syria, but the government and the military are controlled by a group called the Alawites. And now the Alawites, they are a smaller sect of the Shia branch of Islam, so they are opposed to the Sunni Muslims. So much of the government and the military is run by a religious minority. So this religious minority holds too much power, or an exorbitant amount of power within the society of Syria. And this leads to a lot of clashes, and this is primarily what fuels the atmosphere for the civil war that we're seeing today. So the Civil War, it began as a series of peaceful protests. Around 2010, 2011, this thing happened across the Middle East that we call the Arab Spring. And basically it was a widespread kind of unification of Arabs across the region who were all protesting for democratic reform. They wanted more democracy in the region, they wanted more control, they wanted more say. And so as these peaceful protests are happening, mainly by Sunni Muslims, the Syrian army starts to crack down on them. They start to match their protests with violence. This leads to the creation of the Free Syrian Army that is primarily manned by Sunni Muslims and defectors from the Syrian army. And over time, this has allowed a scenario where there's multiple different rebel groups who are all fighting. They don't fight together, they're not a unified force against Assad, but they all have a similar desire to see Assad removed from power. So as the civil war has progressed, it began in 2011, so now we are entering into the 8th year of the war. More people started to get involved. So if we look at the map, Syria shares a border with both Iraq and Turkey. And so what that allowed to do is it allowed ISIS, who began their reign of terror in Iraq, it allowed them to move into Syria because it's just right across the border. So they moved into northeastern Syria, a land that is primarily dominated by the Kurds. Do we know what the Kurds are? Have we talked about the Kurds?
Kind of.
Kind of. You guys, do you know the term? Yeah. So the Kurds are an ethnic group that live in the area where northeastern Syria meets Iraq and Turkey. There's about 30 million Kurds living in that area, and it was their land that ISIS was primarily coming into. So what happened is, in our attempt, because the U.S., we don't like ISIS, right? We see them as like persona non grata. They're big-time terrorists in our eyes. So what we did is we aligned ourselves with the Kurdish people in an attempt to drive ISIS from the region. They were our main allies in Syria, because remember, we don't get along very well with President Assad. So U.S. forces come into Syria, we align ourselves with the Kurds, they help us drive ISIS out of the region, and basically that takes us up to today, because it was only recently, I believe in the spring of 2019, that it became the press release came out that ISIS had been driven from the region, and the Kurds were able to take control of that region and set up, it's not an independent state, but they were able to set up this atmosphere of self-government. Because the Kurds, their purpose, or not their purpose, but their main desire, and throughout all this conflict, is to develop their own independent state. They feel they are a separate ethnic group from the rest of the region, and they want autonomy. They want to have a government run by them for them. And that is one of the main things that President Assad does not want. So if we look at this on a global scale, and this comes back to our essential question, how this civil war that's been taking place in a relatively small country in the Middle East has had such a profound global impact, has been mainly through the humanitarian and refugee crisis that it has created. Over the course of the conflict, over 6 million Syrian civilians have been displaced. Do we know what a refugee is? Is everyone clear on what the definition of refugee? Cool, so over 6 million Syrians have become displaced because of this conflict, and millions more in Syria have become displaced throughout the country. So they haven't necessarily moved out or emigrated out from Syria, but their homes have been destroyed, so they're kind of just wandering around the deserts, or moving from one city to the next, just looking to find food and shelter. And then also Assad has been accused of using chemical weapons on his people. So this is kind of one of the big key points that got the global community in to the ground on Syria, is the fact that he was using chemical weapons, because those have been outlawed since World War I. You can't use them, it doesn't matter what your reasoning behind them, you're not supposed to be using them. And he was using them on his own people, which makes it even worse, right? But to him, he was able to kind of work around it because he sees these rebels as terrorists. So he doesn't view them as his own people, he views them as people who need to be destroyed. So here's a little chart that kind of shows how the refugee crisis has spread. So you'll see the numbers here next to the countries. Those are the number of Syrian refugees who have immigrated into the country. So you'll see as time goes on, those numbers keep going up, and they keep going up, and they keep going up. And this has put a lot of strain on the Mediterranean world and Europe, because these people are looking for a place to go. It's very similar to the refugee crisis that's going on in America right now, right? People coming up from South and Central America up through Mexico, trying to gain access into our country because their country, they can't live there anymore. So it's a very similar situation what's going on, and you're seeing a lot of pushback from European and Middle Eastern countries due to this refugee crisis. So the global politics, and another reason why this has become such a big issue is that Syria is Russia's closest ally in the Middle East. Within Syria, Russia has a port, and that is their only port access to the Mediterranean Sea. So they have aligned themselves very closely to President Assad, and Russia will do anything to make sure that Assad stays in power. Also, other allies of President Assad and Syria include Iran and China. And so what this has created is a situation where the U.S. has to be very careful about how we act in Syria. Why would we not want to, of these three countries, are these Russia, Iran, and China, are these countries that we have good relationships with? No, right? These are countries that we may not be at open odds with them, but we do not have good relations with them. We're kind of at this like secret little conflict that we got going on. Nobody wants to talk about it because we're worried that it'll blow up in our faces. But we're always like politically moving and maneuvering to make sure that we can keep Russia, China, and Iran out of our space. And so what essentially the civil war in Syria has become is a proxy war. Does anyone know what a proxy war is? What that term is? Anyone? No? So a proxy war is basically, if you think back, I think the most prevalent example in U.S. history would be Vietnam. So Vietnam was a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. We didn't fight directly with Russia, but we both had influence on the region, and Vietnam became a site of conflict between the two. And that's kind of what Syria has become. We're not openly at conflict with Russia, China, or Iran. We're not even at open conflict with Syria. But this has become a location where it's a battle of ideals, and it's a proxy. We are fighting a war by proxy, so we're not necessarily in it, but we have influence in it. Does that make sense? Okay. So to finish, we're going to come back to our essential question, and we're going to think about how this civil war in the country has had such a global impact. So what do you guys think? There is no right or wrong answer to this question, but if I gave this question to you as a homework question, what would be some of the things that stood out to you as far as how this is impacting us on a global scale? Yeah. So the refugee crisis, yeah. That's good. Anything else? Any other takeaways other than the refugee crisis? How this is impacting us globally?
It can cause more problems with other countries.
Cause more problems. So if China and Iran and Russia were to get more involved, and that created a situation where the U.S. has to get more involved, maybe this will escalate and it'll spill over into other countries or other regions. It's very good. Yeah?
A lot of oil comes out of the Middle East.
So the Middle East is a very strategic region on a global scale, and making sure that there is stability in that region is really beneficial for us all. Any other thoughts? No? Yeah?
How Assad's using chemical weapons to kill his own people.
Yeah, that's a big humanitarian issue, right? Like, we don't want to have someone out there who's not got the best, looking out for his people. And if he's breaking international laws, because the not using chemical weapons is an international law. It's something that we all agree we're going to abide by. And if he's not, then other people might feel like they don't have to either, right? So, yeah. ISIS, yep. So they pose a threat to us. They pose a threat to many other countries within the Middle East. So making sure that we keep them contained and keep them defeated is a big deal. All right, awesome. So now we are going to go ahead and look at some political cartoons. So I will go ahead and hand these out. Do you want to put the questions on the board or have them?
Yep. I tell you what, once you get your Chromebooks up and you can access the questions that go along with the political cartoons, if you go down to the Middle East.
Can they write on these, or do you have enough?
I'm actually going to post it here, so if they'd like to write on them, they can.
All right, well then I will hand these out.
Yeah. So it says political cartoon questions. Does everybody see that? It's right next to the hummus.
Yep.
Right? Political cartoon questions. So you need to pull that up. Again, it's underneath the Middle East tab. It's almost a little over halfway down. Underneath Syria notes, Syria political cartoons, and then political cartoon questions. You can click on that, open that up, and then you can make a copy of it, and then you can type into it. Sound good? You can write your own responses there. Mr. Glick will have some more instruction on how.
All right.
You can break that down.
So everybody got one, correct? We're all good? Would you like one? Alright, so we're going to go ahead and work through this first one together. Just because, how many of you guys have ever seen a political cartoon before? How many of you guys, do you guys like to look at political cartoons, or is it just something you came across once or twice? Like to look at political cartoons? Alright, so to try to, for those of us that haven't been exposed to this before, as a class we're going to go together and we're going to look at the first one. And so these questions, basically, these are just reflection questions. So we're looking at, who do you think the intended audience of this work is? Does the image have a central theme or message? Because political cartoons are always trying to tell us something. It's commentary on something that's going on in the world. So, do I have a volunteer who would like to read through the first one? Yeah, awesome.
Here's some guns and stuff so you can kill the ISIS bad guys for us. Does it go down or do you go straight?
So you're going to go from left to right and then back down. So you go over to here and then back down.
These will come in handy as we fight to crush our enemies and take over Syria. Soon we will have the power to force others to adhere to our new and brutal laws. Then we will turn these weapons back on you because we hate America most of all. To be clear, you promised to go after ISIS first, and that's my plan.
Awesome. Alright, so what do you guys think? Just taking a look at this. Are we all clear what was going on? You all got it? Alright, so who do you think the intended audience, who was this political cartoon created for? It could be a group of people, it could be a country, it could be men, women, 2-year-olds. What do you guys think? Who's the intended target? Yeah.
ISIS?
ISIS? So you think that they're the ones that this is supposed to adhere to? So ISIS is shown. Where do you think this image would have been put out at? Where do you think we could have found this image?
Well, right here it has like a sign that says Syrian rebels.
So
I
that's
guess
telling us who the people are. Who is the man that's giving them the weapons? Barack Obama. So do you think maybe it's a commentary on America's position in Syria, how we're behaving in the region? So maybe the intended audience is the American public. Maybe the intended audience is the Democratic Party. The intended audience might be the Republican Party. And this is kind of what you got to think through when you're looking at these political cartoons. We got to think, who is this intended for, right? So if you think about like with music, all art has an intended audience. So there are some songs like a Justin Bieber song. The audience is not everyone, right? Like 50-year-old men are not the intended target audience for a Justin Bieber song. And that's something we kind of got to think about when you're listening to a song. You got to think, who is this for? So if we go to the next one. Does this image have a central theme or message? What do you guys think? What is the main tale that this image is trying to tell? If we go back and reread it, what does it say about America's position in Syria? Yeah.
I don't know for sure, but I think it's trying to say that we shouldn't be giving them the weapons.
Okay. So that we shouldn't be giving them the weapons. Why not?
Because they're just going to turn on us.
Very good. Okay. What else?
We have a lot of power, but we're not using it right.
A lot of power, but not using it wisely. Very good. Yeah. Some other thoughts. Do you guys think there's more than one message in here? Are there a couple lessons we could learn from this? Or is it basically just a commentary on U.S. involvement? Yeah.
I think there's a couple because he says, here's some guns and stuff so you can kill the ISIS bad guys for us.
Yeah.
So we're trying to get someone else to
Mhm.
kill them, but then they also don't like America.
Yeah.
Most of all.
Yep.
Because
Well, and it's kind of have you guys heard the phrase, the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Right? And so it's kind of that concept where we have us and the Syrian rebels, we have this common enemy that's ISIS. But when that common enemy is defeated, what's going to happen? The Syrian rebels are going to view us as the new enemy. So, awesome. All right. I think the next question is, why do you think the artist chose this subject matter? Do you think it's because it was topical? Do you think it's because the artist felt really passionately about what was happening in Syria? Or do you think it's more just informative? The artist wanted to get the information out there to the general population. Any thoughts? Yeah.
I think it's more of like getting the information out to the public.
Okay, so like a public service announcement about what's going on in Syria. Anyone have other thoughts? Alright, that's good. And then the last question is, do you guys have any questions? Do you still have any questions about this image? Is there anything that's unclear? Yeah, Casey.
Going back to what he answered, I kind of agree because they're trying to make the public aware of what might happen.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Yeah.
Is the person for the Syrian rebels a specific person?
I don't believe it's meant to be a specific person, just a group in general. Any other questions on this image before we go to the next one? No? Alright, so for the next image, if we get through the next one, we'll go to 3 and 4. But I want you guys to, we're going to do this, but I want you guys to do it with a partner. So if you get in 2 or 3, the person next to you, the person behind you, kind of work through the image and work through these questions. I'll be around if you guys are struggling or need help. But let's go ahead and look at this with a partner and see if we can figure out what's going on with these political cartoons. Okay?
Additional to the government imposed, I changed topics.
Okay.
So basically, it's just saying that it's just basically saying.
Like you change stuff.
How long is this class?
You've got about 8, 9 minutes.
Okay. Do you want to try to get the word of the day in? No? Okay.
Oh, you're doing
Alright.
great stuff.
Just saying.
What did you say?
I think this is more for like the Syrian people.
Oh, yeah.
What is that? So it's annotation has been allowed, so that's saying,
Casey, you
what
got a
about
question?
change?
No?
So,
Is it for a grade? Does it matter?
so how does this apply? Why does the artist change the material scenario where?
This is more just an exercise to get us thinking, right? It's going to help us down the road.
What if he understands
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, you're
Is he trying to present that idea, or is that what we're getting?
for your answers.
That's what
You
we're
don't
getting.
necessarily have to write them out, but I just want you to like think through the question.
Okay,
So yeah.
Nothing's changed, but he's saying, hey, look, I've changed time, I'm making an effort to do it.
You can answer
I'm making
the
an
questions
effort
if you'd
to
like,
change.
but I'm more
But
interested in
is
just
he really
like
making
this
an
is more
effort,
just a guide
right?
to help you guys think about the
change
images
I think
you
rights
can
violate
okay?
that.
But if it helps you to type them out, feel free to go ahead.
So you guys-
Yeah. Okay.
What is this thing?
What he's wearing on his face?
For number 2 on the
That is a gas mask.
Okay, and then what's the flash? Hey, there's a skull on the flash.
Mhm.
And then what's the flag?
The flag is Syria. So who is the guy that that's supposed to be representing? Assad. Yep.
Okay, so it is thinking about what do you think the artist is famous with? It's basically talking about how he's people live and everything. And how he's wearing a gas mask because he's trying to protect himself and kill all of it. Then there's a skull on top of it, on top of the flag because he's killing all these civilians. Is this image has any central theme or message? Why do you think
Do you have 3 questions?
I do.
Okay. Yeah. I saw you. Yeah. Sure.
So, I thought about doing that one, but I think that would maybe a little tough, so you can just maybe just repeat the idea and then use that for the last one.
Okay.
As that is just gonna refer to that, like that, it's just a simple question of.
Okay. Who? Yep.
And then this one, that'd be the one that could separate.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Get that one.
Yeah.
It gives us an opportunity to reiterate what
The minority aspect.
Yeah, Syria is protected by Syria is like a little place where it can be overruled.
Is that a cheeseburger backpack?
Russia is the big place.
Yeah, that has the most potential.
Syria is the other one that Russia really wants to protect.
What happened to your thumb, Kate?
My basketball's playing.
Nice.
And jammed it in my nail.
Did it come all the way off, or?
Well, no, it just like
Like,
ripped it.
if we actually want Syria, then there's gonna be like big consequences from like Russia.
You guys have any questions? Yeah.
You're still working on the first one. How many we can get to move on? You've done all of them. Go through those questions, like on the, you made a copy of it, and go through those questions on each one as well.
Who's protecting?
We went to the question and answer, so you can know it's about.
I like this specific question. I like these cartoons, but they are getting to be a little bit dated.
Mm-hmm.
The Obama administration
I'm sure there'll be a whole fresh batch ones after after this week, yeah, or even this month. I can't. If you didn't write on them, I can recollect them. But or unless, would you want to keep them? They're online if you ever. If you ever get bored and you're like, hey, I want to look at some Glick cartoons. What?
That's what we should do. I should have a segment on the website with little cartoons for each of our.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
You good?
I'd make her like you if I could, but I don't think I can. Are those pockets on your flip-flops? That's great. Never seen flip-flops with pockets. That's genius though. Like you've just been wasting all that space on flip-flops for years.
Did you want to answer or ask the
Yeah,
questions or wrap
yeah.
things up?
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's the one.
All right.
All right, guys. Mr. Glick.